slid up just now. Once the beam slides down, and goes all this into it. Oh, and me coming up again. Not good Yes, they do. No. Oh, yes, yes. I agree with that.
A 1,000 days. Tomorrow marks 1,000 days of Putin's barbaric, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Over the weekend, we saw the latest brutality with the biggest aerial attack on Ukraine since August, killing and injuring dozens of civilians. It was designed not only to kill Ukrainians, but to take out, effectively, Ukraine's power infrastructure and to cause blackouts. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness. But today, standing here with my friend, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Andrii Sybiha, the UK is showing our support to Ukraine is ironclad. We will help keep the lights of Ukraine on in the face of Putin's aggression. For 1,000 days, Ukraine has courageously resisted Russia's aggression. And that matters not just for Ukraine's security, Britain's security, or indeed Europe's security. It matters because Putin, if he succeeds in Ukraine, he will tip the world beyond the tipping point that we are on, a point where the principles of the UN Charter, self-determination, territorial integrity, and international law are lost, and there's no meaning. So this is a grim milestone, and I'm here at the United Nations to say to member states, unless Putin fails, the wars of conquest will be back. Unless Putin fails, our faith in international law will never return. Unless Putin fails, all of our borders will not be safe. The Kremlin is now turning to Iran for ballistic missiles. It's turning to North Korea for foot soldiers. These are dangerous escalations that show, frankly, how desperate Putin has become. Today, I can announce that the UK is sanctioning Iran Air, sanctioning Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, and we are absolutely determined to exact the maximum pay for Russia's industrial complex. Its mercenary groups in Africa are subject to these, with links to the Kremlin. Its shadow fleet, of course, we've gone after, and malicious cyber Russian gangs and Kremlin mouthpieces. And we will have more to say on that in the coming months. My message is very clear. We will counter Russian aggression at every turn. 1,000 days in, we still stand for Ukraine. 1,000 days in, we still stand for international order. 1,000 days in, we still stand for the principles which the United Nations was founded upon. And 1,000 days in, we're ready to face down this aggression. We've seen the wrecking just today that Russia is capable of on humanitarian catastrophes like Sudan. Let us ensure that they do not succeed in their tyranny in Ukraine. Andrii.
I thank my friend my friend Secretary Lammy for setting Russian aggression as a priority for the UK presidency. This global threat demands global response. When I departed for New York, Russia undertook one of the most massive air attacks against Ukraine. With my wife and children, we had a sleepless night, just like thousands of other Ukrainian families. About 90 drones and 120 missiles of all types across the country. Russia once again targeted civilians and energy infrastructure ahead of winter, intentionally. Such strikes are a constant, horrible reality in Ukraine. This time, Russian missiles targeted our nuclear energy system. In particular, transmission substations, which are part of our nuclear power plants. Such Russian strikes create unacceptable risks for our nuclear safety and security. This is a danger not only for Ukraine, but for the entire world. Russia's massive missile attack is a response to all those who called and visited Putin recently, to those who shook his hand, held telephone talks with him, asked him for peace. He only wants war, and he will only stop when we stop him and force him to accept a just peace. Tomorrow marks 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion. In total, Russian aggression against Ukraine has already lasted more than 10 years. I would like to remind this. 1,000 days is a big number, and it shows how urgent it is to achieve a comprehensive, just and long-lasting peace. It also shows the failure of existing international mechanisms and the need to update them. Russian aggression harms not only Ukraine, but many more countries and people. It caused a number of global crises in food, energy, security, and other areas affecting millions of people. Today, at the Security Council meeting, I will speak about the price of this war for Ukraine and the world. Price of this war. The terrible price we have already paid, and the price we will have to pay if wrong decisions are taken now. I will also explain why peace at any cost, or rather at the cost of the UN Charter, will not work. We need real and just peace, and it can only be achieved through strength, not appeasement. Russia creates global security threats by consolidating military alliances with such rogue states as Iran and DPRK. In February 2022, many experts predicted Ukraine's quick collapse, and they were wrong. But none could have envisioned the presence of North Korean troops in Europe fighting against a European country. If not stopped, Russia will continue the proliferation of war. The Security Council must keep addressing the Russia crisis, including within the Council itself. I mean Russia's illegal occupation of the Soviet permanent seat. Ukraine's stance is clear and well known. Comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on UN Charter, this is at the center of the peace formula. This war is much larger than Ukraine. It will define the future of European and global security, the future of international order, order based on international law. We must take the right steps and decisions. We must not repeat the mistakes of the past. Recently, President Zelensky presented the Victory Plan as a tool to enforce the peace formula. And we must take strong steps to compel Russia toward a just and lasting peace. This is the peace through strength concept, and our joint efforts will help stop the aggression and achieve such peace. This is the interest of all of us. Thank you. Thank you, my dear friend.
We'll take a few brief questions.
Let's start.
Minister.
Ambassador,
Thank you. Mr. Ministers and Mr. Secretary, Pamela Falk from U.S. News and World Report. How worried are you? You said that the attack in this weekend was deplorable. How worried are both of you of the President-elect of the United States position, President-elect Trump on Ukraine?
Today, we are dealing with Russian aggression, lives, civilian lives lost, energy supplies shut down, over 100 missiles, over 100 drones today. And that requires a response from Ukraine and its allies today. And that is what we will continue to do to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, recognizing that we have winter months ahead, that Ukraine must get through those winter months, and recognizing that the international community has come together to pledge a lot of military equipment and money. It's important that that gets out the door and puts Ukraine in the strongest possible position in 2025. Now look, I've been coming to the United States for all of my adult life. That's over 30 years. I've studied in this country, I've worked in this country, and I know that there's a simple rule: one president at a time. And so we're dealing with President Biden, and we are committed to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position.
Mr. Lammy, with Mondo Weiss.
With your permission.
Sorry.
Thanks a lot for your question. You see, I will start with sharing with my memories. As I said, I started this trip together with all Ukrainian families. Experiences the most intensive missile attack. And that's the daily reality for our Ukrainian families, for our children, sleepless night, sirenas. And that's why I felt really uncomfortable today morning here in New York without sirenas. And you see, keeping in mind that my people suffering, we must stop, and we must stop this aggression. To have a normal life, that's not a privilege. And I think that the world have enough power to stop this aggression. Speaking about future cooperation with the new administration, we see as a chance new opportunities to speed up the process of achievement long-lasting, just, comprehensive peace for Ukraine. We are confident in the support of USA. We are confident in bipartisan support, and we consider that this war is not about Ukraine. It's not, you see, a donation. It's a true contribution for the future security, global security, European security. We are fighting for our common values.
Mr. Lammy, may I ask?
Mr. Ministers, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. President Biden's administration has just authorized the use of longer-range missiles in Russia. Mr. Minister, what impact do you believe that can have on the war and on achieving the kind of peace that Ukraine wants? And Minister Lammy, is the United Kingdom going to follow suit and authorize similar use of its long-range missiles? Thank you.
Madam, thanks a lot for this so important question. So briefly, it could be a game changer. And the longer Ukraine can strike, the shorter the war will be. And our Ukraine's position has always been clear. We have a full right to strike military targets on the territory of Russia. It is our legitimate right, and it will save our lives of our civilians. It could have very positive impact on the situation on the battlefield.
Look, let me just say that I don't want to be drawn on the use of long-range missiles, and that is because it risks operational security, and it can only play into the hands of Putin, and I will do nothing to play into the hands of Putin. There are now 10,000 North Korean troops in Russia, linking the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic. As we meet here in the UN, 1,000 days into this war, none of us would have considered such a transshipment of troops. This is a major, major escalation. And so I repeat what Prime Minister Starmer has said since coming to office. We must stand with Ukraine, put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, and that is what the United Kingdom will continue to do. And of course, we continue to work very, very closely with President Biden. That's why I was with Tony Blinken last week meeting in Brussels.
Minister Lammy, David Kattenberg with Mondo Weiss. Russia.
Universal question.
No, it what? You're right.
The 9,788th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber this afternoon. Your presence underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Turkey and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. And in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary De Carlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary De Carlo, and I thank her. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm pleased to read a statement today on behalf of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who unfortunately could not make the session. 1,000 days have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in brazen violation of the UN Charter and international law. 1,000 days of widespread death, destruction, and despair that continue unabated for millions of Ukrainians. 1,000 days in, this war rages on, undiminished. Deadly battles engulf more and more of eastern and southern Ukraine. Entire cities, villages, and towns have been reduced to rubble. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Vovchansk, and Volodar have been virtually wiped off the map. Since February 2022, at least 12,164 civilians have been killed, including over 600 children. At least 26,871 others have been injured. And these are just the confirmed numbers. The actual death toll is likely much higher. The past several months have seen a significant increase in civilian casualties. October and November saw some of the most intense and large-scale missile and drone attacks of the war. Over the weekend, Russia launched one of its largest combined strikes, reportedly involving 120 missiles and 90 drones and targeting energy infrastructure in all Ukrainian regions, which resulted in severe damage and casualties. Last night, there were also media reports that Ukrainian forces would be given authorization to use long-range weapons supplied by partners for strikes within Russia. I want to be clear. All parties must ensure the safety and protection of civilians regardless of their location. Across Ukraine, residential areas have increasingly come under attack. The people of Kiev are again being forced to take shelter from nightly drone and missile barrages. Critical civilian and energy infrastructure in Ukraine are systematically targeted and decimated, depriving many Ukrainians of access to basic needs. At least 580 medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed, with many first responders and medical personnel killed and injured. And at least 1,358 educational facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Ukraine has now become one of the world's most heavily mined places, with almost 1/4 of its territory contaminated with mines, an area 4 times the size of Switzerland. The environmental degradation caused by the war, including from the destruction of critical infrastructure, such as the Kakhovka Dam, has resulted in long-term consequences for local ecosystems as well as Ukraine's agriculture. Millions of traumatized people are dependent on life-saving humanitarian aid. Nearly 4 million remain internally displaced, and more than 6.8 million have fled the country. And in every conflict, women are disproportionately impacted by the economic and social consequences of the war. An entire generation of children is being deprived of proper education as attacks have driven schools online or underground in shelters. Meanwhile, human rights continue to be systematically violated. Mr. President, the Black Sea remains a flashpoint. Renewed Russian attacks on civilian vessels and port infrastructure, particularly in Odessa, are once again exacerbating global food security. I am determined to continue my engagement with all concerned to support the freedom and safety of navigation in the Black Sea. Mr. President, the targeted devastation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure may make the coming winter the harshest since the start of the war. It is not difficult to imagine how daily and prolonged power cuts aggravate living conditions, acutely affecting the more than 2 million people whose homes have been damaged or destroyed and those near the front lines. The UN remains fully mobilized to support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery efforts. This includes critical support to enhance the resilience of the country's energy infrastructure. Our immediate focus is on the winter response plan, but without required resources, the most vulnerable will lack sufficient protection. Unimpeded humanitarian access is essential to reach some 1.5 million people in regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. Those areas remain beyond our reach. At the same time, the operating environment for humanitarian actors has become more dangerous. This year so far, at least 9 humanitarian workers have been killed in the line of duty and more than 35 injured. This is unacceptable. Despite the international community's grave concerns, the risk of nuclear incident remains all too real, as military activities continue to be reported near Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia and other sensitive locations in the conflict zone. The consequences of such an event would be catastrophic and should make us all shudder. It is imperative for all parties to act responsibly to ensure nuclear safety and security. Mr. President, the recent reported deployment of thousands of troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the conflict zone and their involvement in the fighting is alarming. This would add fuel to the fire, further escalating and internationalizing this explosive conflict. There is little doubt that this war at the heart of Europe is a conflict with global implications. It undermines regional stability and deepens geopolitical divisions. It must end. Reversing the current dangerous path will require concerted diplomatic efforts and political will. It is high time for a just peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. We stand ready to use our good offices and to make available the tools and experience of the United Nations in full support of all meaningful efforts toward a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom. Thank you, Rosemary, again for your briefing. And thank you again, Andrii, for joining us this afternoon. Here in this council, 1,000 days into Putin's full-scale invasion, the UK is keeping the spotlight on Ukraine, not just for the security of the Ukrainian people or just for Europe's security, but for something much more fundamental, which every UN member should care about: the right to be a sovereign, independent country, free to choose its future, protect its borders, and stand up to aggression. Everyone on this council should be familiar from the climate crisis with the concept of tipping points, the critical moment after which changes are irreversible. These exist in geopolitics as they do in science. And unless Putin fails, I believe we face one over Ukraine. Unless Putin fails, we could plunge into a world where the principles enshrined in the UN Charter will have lost their meaning. Unless Putin fails, others will be inspired to wage imperialist wars of conquest. Unless Putin fails, our faith in international law may never return. And unless Putin fails, each of our borders will be less safe. If anyone doubted Putin's intent this weekend's massive missile attack on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure should serve as a reminder. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness. For years, the Kremlin has tried to bully Ukraine into submission. Russian missiles have struck hospitals and grain ships destined for Africa. Russian troops have raped and tortured Ukrainian prisoners, and Russian police have abducted Ukrainian children for indoctrination in Russia. Like a desperate gambler, Putin has got all in on this illegal war. Putin has lost so many soldiers, 1,000 days into a war he thought he would win in days. He's now turning to North Korea for reinforcements and to Iran for ballistic missiles. These actions must be met with a firm response, and that's why today I can announce fresh sanctions on Iran Air and Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, a direct response to Iran's ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. We are using the full force of our sanctions to constrain the Kremlin's illegal actions, from their shadow fleet of oil tankers to suppliers to their war machine, from shady kleptocrats to mercenaries destabilizing the continent of Africa. And we are stepping up our support to put Putin in a position of strength with a new loan backed by profits from sanctioned Russian assets, part of a new G7 package of $50 billion in assistance, and a commitment to £3 billion in military aid for as long as it takes. Let me be crystal clear. There is no equivalence, no comparison, no parallel between those reckless states who support Russia's illegal aggression and those who stand with Ukraine in defense of its sovereignty. Council, the Kremlin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness, but we must stand for the light of its freedom. Ukraine and its partners want peace in line with the UN Charter that brings us together today. But we know that Putin only responds to strength. To have a lasting peace, lasting security, we've got to stand as strong, as united, as patient, as determined as the Ukrainian people. And so I say that my message to Vladimir Putin is simple. We will never let up on countering Russian aggression at every turn. 1,000 days in, we stand for Ukraine. 1,000 days in, we still stand for international order. 1,000 days in, we still stand for the principles which the United Nations was founded upon. And 1,000 days in, we're ready to face down your aggression as the day you started this senseless war. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie également la secrétaire générale adjointe Rosemary Di Carlo pour son intervention. Et je souhaite également la bienvenue à notre collègue ukrainien, le ministre des Affaires étrangères, Andrii Sybiha. Alors que nous commémorons le 1000e jour de la guerre, les mots nous manquent face aux souffrances de votre pays. À travers vous, chers collègues, j'adresse mes pensées au peuple ukrainien. Depuis 1000 jours, plus de 10 000 civils ont été tués, plus de 20 000 blessés, sans oublier les immenses pertes parmi les soldats. Derrière ces chiffres sans âme se cachent des hommes, des femmes et des enfants. Un drame. Nous sommes profondément préoccupés par les attaques massives contre les infrastructures énergétiques des derniers jours. Un danger majeur pour la population civile à l'approche de l'hiver. La Suisse appelle encore et encore au respect du droit international, au respect du droit international humanitaire. Excellences, chers collègues, depuis 1000 jours, tous ces appels à la paix sont restés vains. Cette guerre est un facteur de déstabilisation internationale majeure. Déstabilisation sur le plan de la sécurité internationale, avec la menace nucléaire. Déstabilisation sur le plan de la sécurité alimentaire et de l'approvisionnement énergétique. Déstabilisation du respect des droits fondamentaux. Et enfin, déstabilisation du multilatéralisme. Le risque d'extension de cette guerre est alarmant. Je me réfère ici au rapport faisant état de la présence militaire de la République démocratique de Corée en Russie. Ces derniers développements sur le champ de bataille mettent en lumière toute l'insoutenabilité de cette guerre pour nous tous. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs, il est temps que la Russie mette fin à sa guerre contre l'Ukraine, lancée en violation de la Charte des Nations Unies. Après 1000 jours de guerre, les armes doivent se taire. Il est temps de trouver une solution diplomatique. La souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine à l'intérieur de ses frontières internationalement reconnues doivent être respectées. Il y a 5 mois, nous étions réunis en Suisse, au Bürgenstock, pour parler pour la première fois au plus haut niveau de paix en Ukraine. Depuis, nous avons poursuivi ces efforts sans relâche et nous continuerons à le faire jusqu'à une solution diplomatique. Monsieur le Président, faire la paix demande du courage. Je l'ai rappelé devant ce Conseil en septembre dernier. Faire la paix demande aussi de l'énergie. L'énergie de poursuivre la voie diplomatique malgré la fatigue, malgré la frustration, en particulier des hommes et des femmes sur place, aux portes d'un 3e hiver de guerre. Le courage d'impliquer toutes les parties dans ce dialogue, y compris la Russie. L'énergie d'appeler encore et encore à l'application de la Charte des Nations Unies ainsi qu'au respect des conventions de Genève et l'énergie d'être à la hauteur de notre humanité. La Suisse soutiendra toutes les initiatives et efforts de paix fondés sur les principes de la Charte de l'ONU. Conscients des enseignements de notre histoire commune, nous sommes prêts à assumer nos responsabilités. pour le peuple ukrainien, certainement, mais aussi pour notre continent européen et pour le monde entier. Nous espérons tous et toutes à la paix et à la stabilité. Je vous en remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Miss Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Lammy, for bringing us together and chairing this important meeting. I thank Undersecretary General Carlo for sharing the Secretary General's statement and sobering briefing. I welcome the participation of Ukraine's foreign minister in this meeting today. 1,000 days ago, February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its brutal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. President Putin believed it would be a quick victory. Ukrainians would succumb, wave the white flag of defeat, and yet the Russian military failed to conquer Ukraine in its existence as an independent country or absorb it into Russia. When he couldn't break the Ukrainian military, Putin ramped up efforts to break the Ukrainian people, killing tens of thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children, uprooting millions of families from their homes, bombing out thousands of schools and hospitals, energy infrastructure and food storage, abducting thousands of Ukrainian children and relocating them into Russia. And yet, for 1,000 days, the people of Ukraine have not broken or bent. But while today is an important marker, there's nothing special about this somber occasion. Winter is approaching, and Russia's relentless attacks have devastated critical infrastructure, leaving millions of homes without light, heat, and water. Russia's seizure and militarization of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant puts all of Europe on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Every day, Ukrainian families live in fear of Russian war crimes. To date, troops have committed some 147,000 of them. And every night, Ukrainian families live in fear of Russian aerial strikes, which continue to pound the country. It is clear that Russia has no regard for Ukrainian life, but it's also clear that Russia has no regard for Russian life. You saw Russia just this morning veto a resolution on Sudan that would have facilitated humanitarian assistance. You heard them declare their support for the Palestinian people. But you, as I know this is just hypocrisy at its best and lies that they are concerned at the worst. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have died fighting this cruel and callous war. And 1,000 days since it began, the carnage has only accelerated. Russia is absorbing more than 1,200 casualties a day, more than at any other time during the war. And so, in its desperation, the Kremlin has turned to the DPRK, first for arms and now for manpower. At least 10,000 soldiers, sent first to eastern Russia and now to the far western Kursk oblasts bordering Ukraine, have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces. It is a move without modern precedent. Not in over 100 years has Russia welcomed foreign troops onto its soil. And it's one in blatant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1718, 1874, 2270, resolutions Russia agreed to only a few years ago. It's not just the DPRK Russia has looked to for help. Putin also acquired hundreds of UAVs from Iran, flagrantly violating Security Council Resolution 2231, All the while, Russia has disregarded its chemical weapons convention obligations and stated publicly it will supply captured weapons to non-state actors, including state sponsors of terrorism. Colleagues, these are the actions of a rogue state. And so rather than try and justify the unjustifiable, Russia simply lies. 1,001 days ago, Russia's representative told us to our face there would be no invasion. As the world watched live broadcasts of Russian forces and tanks crossing into Ukrainian territory and Russian missiles raining down on Kyiv, he continued to insist in this council there was nothing to see here. The lies continued. We were told that no North Koreans were deploying through Russia. Now North Koreans are fighting on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. All the while, this chamber has been flooded with slurs and baseless accusations against Ukraine's democratically elected leaders, along with specious arguments about how Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own path and partners somehow threaten Russia's so-called legitimate interests or legitimate security concerns. Of course, the UN Charter is very clear. No country, quote unquote, security concerns, legitimate or otherwise, give it the right to dictate another country's policies, let alone invade and annex another country's territory. All of this comes down to the fact that Putin has simply never accepted that Ukraine, a fellow UN member state, has the same rights to sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. Indeed, he has gone on the record multiple times saying, quote, Ukraine is not even a state, unquote. Perhaps it's why Putin so underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainian people, how bravely and effectively they have been able to defend their homeland, their democratically elected government, their culture and way of life for 1,000 days. As Ukrainians continue the fight against imperialist invasion and might makes right ideology, the United States stands with them. And let me be clear, when this war ends, a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine will be in control of its internationally recognized territory and continue on the path to joining Euro-Atlantic institutions like NATO. Until then, and at the direction of the President, the United States will continue to surge security assistance to Ukraine, including artillery, air defense, armored vehicles, and other needed capabilities and munitions. And we will announce additional security assistance for Ukraine in the days to come. Because ultimately, supporting Ukraine in Congress and beyond it cannot be and should not be a partisan issue. Standing up for democracy and human rights is above petty politics and outlasts any one leader or term. There's much talk about peace in Ukraine. Believe me, we would love nothing more than to see the people of Ukraine experience the safety and security they so deserve. But a peace that is not just is not peace. A peace that is not sustainable is not peace. And a peace that is not Ukraine-led is not a true peace. And so I call on all UN member states to support Ukraine's formula for a just and lasting peace, one that fully respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and holds Russia to account for its crimes and violations of the UN Charter. I again call on another permanent member of this council, China, to stop stoking war on the European continent, to end enabling Russia's war effort, to cease providing dual-use goods to Russia, and to quit parroting Russian talking points to justify this war, because there is no justification. Most of all, I call on Russia to end its aggression against Ukraine and now. In the support to countries like Iran and the DPRK, support that foments instability, not only in Europe, but everywhere from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, in the assault on food security around the world, and especially in the Sahel, where millions of hungry people rely on the Black Sea Grain Initiative for sustenance, and in the needless suffering of Ukrainian and Russian people who have endured the unimaginable for 1,000 days. Let this misery, this madness, not continue, not one day more. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her excellent statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Fuji Hisayuki, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary Lammy for organizing this meeting. I would also like to thank USG Carlo for her comprehensive briefing. It has been 1,000 days since Russia began its aggression against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. To the people of Ukraine who have been defending their country for these 1,000 days, we express our deepest respect and unwavering solidarity. Last Saturday, Minister for Foreign Affairs Iwaya visited Ukraine and directly expressed to Minister Sybiha Japan's intention to cooperate with Ukraine to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, and stated that our steadfast commitment to stand with Ukraine remained unchanged. Mr. President, we are appalled by the massive and widespread missile barrage on Ukraine over the past week, which caused the casualties of innocent civilians. We will continue to condemn in the strongest terms Russia's illegal aggression, which has caused unimaginable human rights violations and abuses in the territory of Ukraine, in addition to the ongoing brutal attacks destroying critical civilian infrastructure. We repeat, Russia must immediately cease this aggression, withdraw from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, Russia continues its aggression against Ukraine with not only its own arsenal, but also weapons supplied by North Korea, violating the relevant Security Council resolutions which Russia had itself agreed upon. There is clear evidence, and subterfuge should never be tolerated in this chamber. The situation now enters another dimension as North Korea's soldiers have been dispatched to Russia, and they are now engaged in combat against Ukraine. Such involvement in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. North Korea's direct support for Russia in this regard has serious potential consequences for European and Indo-Pacific peace and security. Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. We condemn in the strongest term this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. We also reiterate our deep concern about military cooperation between Iran and Russia. The international community must refrain from supporting Russia's aggression directly or indirectly. Mr. President, the importance of diplomacy and dialogue for peace is indisputable. However, it should be crystal clear that Ukraine is not the one who is waging this war. Ukraine was forced to fight to defend itself. It is Russia that launched an unprovoked war of aggression. Once Russia stops its aggression and withdraws to the internationally recognized border, it will end immediately. What is needed now is not a call for peace that ignores Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, nor a demand for both sides to be escalated in an equal manner, which only rewards the aggressor. The question is whether to uphold or disregard the principles of the UN Charter. It cannot be clearer who violates the Charter. We must uphold the international order based on the rule of law and never tolerate violation of international law. Japan will continue its diplomatic efforts together with Ukraine and the international community to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Japan is committed to and will continue its long-term efforts to rebuild the lives of the Ukrainian people and the entire country. We have already pledged over $12 billion in support of Ukraine in the areas of humanitarian assistance, recovery, reconstruction, and finance, which are steadily being implemented. We will continue to provide support, including in the areas of energy supplies and landmine removal. To conclude, Mr. President, we emphasize that any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force is unacceptable anywhere in the world. Japan stands firmly with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fuji for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marko Stucin, Deputy Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Minister, for organizing this briefing. I would also like to thank Under Secretary General Carlo, delivering the statement on behalf of UN Secretary General. And I would also like to warmly welcome Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sybiha at this meeting. Tomorrow will mark 1,000 days of war in Ukraine, 1,000 days of death, destruction, and displacement, but also 1,000 days of inaction of this very council. I have just returned from Kiev, and while being humbled by Ukraine's perseverance and determination, I'm also deeply disturbed by the dire situation that the civilian population is facing as the country enters the third winter of this war of aggression. Just in terms of the toll on human lives, these 1,000 days have been catastrophic. Last week, I have also visited Bucha, one of many sites where mass graves were found in the first months of the war in Ukraine. In just one of them, 508 Ukrainians are buried, and the bloodshed continues. It is estimated that in the first half of this year, 3 times as many people died in Ukraine as there were born. The number of civilian casualties is at its highest in the last 2 years. This gloomy picture is only about to get worse as Ukrainians brace themselves for the winter. Just yesterday, Russia launched its largest aerial attack on Ukraine in months, hitting energy infrastructure across the country with more than 200 drones and missiles. Continuous deliberate attacks against energy infrastructure are not just military tactics. They are, first and foremost, attacks on civilians, taking away their lives, cutting off their heating, breaking their spirits. These attacks are a despicable violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, for 1,000 days we have been discussing the casualties of the war, and each time our deliberations were followed by silence and impunity. With each day of inaction by this Council, the integrity of international law, including the Charter, was diminished. A lot is at stake with this war. It is more important than ever that the Council members condemn aggression, that we demand respect for international humanitarian and human rights law, and that we make it clear to the perpetrators of war crimes that they will not get away with it and will be held accountable. A single day of war is one too many. There are no words to describe how tormenting 1,000 days of war are. We need a just and lasting peace as soon as possible. A peace that would not come at the expense of the fundamentals of international law, a peace that will be based on UN Charter and its key principles, safeguarding Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine, as the country under attack, must of course agree with any such peace plan. This is the only way to stop this war, and this war must stop. Until then, Slovenia will support Ukraine every step of the way. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Susin for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أتقدم بالشكر للسيدة روزماري دي كارلو على إحاطتها القيمة. يأتي اجتماعنا هذا والأوضاع في أوكرانيا لا تزال محل قلق عميق، أين الحرب لا تزال تحصد الأرواح البشرية البريئة وتدفع أعدادا كبيرة من المدنيين على الفرار بحثا عن ملاذ آمن، حيث أدى هذا الصدام بين الطرفين الأوكراني والروسي إلى مأساة إنسانية. كما أن هذه الحرب التي طال أمدها خلفت ولا تزال خسائر مادية فادحة ودمارا هائلا في البنى التحتية. والذي يثير قلقنا أيضا هو أننا نكاد نكون سلمنا بحتمية الأمر في ظل غياب أي تغير في الأوضاع على الميدان، وبالرغم من تعدد المبادرات الفردية منها والدولية لتقريب المواقف ووجهات النظر. منطق التصعيد والمواجهة وكذا منطق الاستقطاب الذي لا زال يهيمن على الأطراف المعنية لا يمكن أن يؤدي بنا إلى مخرج لهذا الوضع المتأزم، مثلما سبقت وأن حذرت الجزائر منه في عدة مناسبات. كما لا تزال بلادي تدعو إلى مواصلة الجهود لإعلاء صوت الحوار ضد لغة الصدام والحرب، إيمانا منا أن الحل لا يمكن أن تتجلى مظاهره إلا من خلال الحوار والطرق السلمية، حيث أن هذا الحوار يكون مبنيا على 3 نقاط أساسية. أولا، ضرورة وقف الأعمال العدائية وحماية المدنيين. ثانياً، الانصياع إلى مبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة وقواعد القانون الدولي التي نتفق كلنا على سموها وطابعها العادل. ثالثاً، معالجة الأسباب الجذرية للنزاع والأخذ بعين الاعتبار للانشغالات الأمنية لكل الأطراف. سيد الرئيس، أصبح من الضروري أن نعمل سوياً لضمان حل دائم لهذا النزاع الذي لم تقتصر تداعياته على المنطقة فحسب، بل توسعت لتثقل كاهل العالم بأكمله، خاصة الدول النامية. ومن هذا المنطلق تظل الجزائر مستعدة للمشاركة البناءة في الجهود لخلق أرضية صلبة لتسهيل الحوار بين الأطراف، وبهدف تعزيز المشاورات على مختلف المستويات ومع كافة الأطراف، ودعم الجهود الرامية إلى إرساء سلام عادل ودائم. وتبقى الجزائر مستعدة لتقديم الدعم اللازم لتغليب لغة السلام واستتباب الأمن في المنطقة. وشكرا.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rosemary Carlo for our briefing. I welcome the participation of the ministers in this meeting, including His Excellency Mr. Andrii Sybiha, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, in this meeting. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the escalating security and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which has persisted for 1,000 days. In recent months, the conflict has escalated drastically, and the battlefield has expanded with intensified offensive operations by both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. With almost 2 years and 9 months of brutal conflict, Sierra Leone regrettably takes note of recent escalatory conduct of intensive large-scale drone attacks on Ukraine, and news reports that restrictions on the use of long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russian territory have been lifted. This follows recent intelligence and open-source reports that troops of the People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, are now engaged in combat in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. The reports, if confirmed, mark a dangerous escalation of the conflict and have the potential to dramatically increase in scope, with severe attendant risk and broader destabilizing impacts on regional and international peace and security. The inability of the Security Council to act further puts at risk its credibility and dependability to maintain and also address threats to international peace and security. Colleagues, given the regrettable, devastating impact of the conflict, let us remind ourselves of the worrying trend of civilian casualties for just the past 4 months. From the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine report of 9 August 2024, Sierra Leone notes an alarming increase in civilian casualties since March this year, with July being the deadliest month, with at least 219 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. The number of civilian casualties, particularly in Ukraine for August, were similarly alarming, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. According to OCHA and OHCHR reports, intensified hostilities and attacks in September 2024 led to another alarming civilian casualty numbers, with at least 208 killed and 1,220 injured. We take note of reports from Ukraine of multiple attacks in October, targeting civilians and vital infrastructure, such as residential areas, markets, railways, and grain storage facilities, using guided area bombs, strike drones, and missiles. Additionally, the attacks have reportedly continued to target and damage numerous civilian facilities across Ukraine, including electricity and gas facilities, despite the winter. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, The humanitarian community launched the 2024 to 2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Sierra Leone calls on the international community to support this plan. We have reiterated in this Council that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services such as hospitals, schools, water and energy facilities are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone deplores attacks on civilians, vital civilian infrastructure, and protected objects. We call on all involved parties to take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. Mr. President, in addition to the mounting humanitarian challenges, OCHA has further indicated that humanitarian response efforts face growing challenges, including safety risks. 6 aid workers were killed or injured in July and August alone. It noted that in the first 9 months of 2024, the humanitarian community had provided at least one form of assistance to 7.2 million out of 8.5 million people targeted for support. This is despite the 2024 humanitarian appeal for Ukraine receiving less than half the requested $3.11 billion. Additional resources are critically needed to ensure much-needed assistance. The drastic escalation, alarming civilian casualty figures, and the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict on civilians, including the elderly, women and children in Ukraine, underscores the urgent need for the violence to end. All parties to the conflict must prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, as Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the seeming strategic approach to annexed territories, we take the opportunity to reiterate the UN Secretary General's instructive statement of 29 September 2022, in which he recalled that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We also recall Security Council Resolution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In a similar manner, we reaffirm the full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Let me close by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and energy infrastructure, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. Peace is made not between friends, but between parties in a state of disagreement. Therefore, peace should be actively pursued and not be left to chance. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting resolution of the conflict. In taking this important step, we further reiterate our call for the full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长的通报。乌克兰危机延宕至今已有1000天， 当前局势的发展走到了十字路口，正处在关键时刻。一方面，地面战事仍在持续，人道危机日益严重，外溢影响不断加剧。冲突双方仍未放下依靠武力战胜对方的执念，仍在相互不断发动大规模袭击，今日正呈扩大态势。另一方面，国际社会围绕乌克兰危机的讨论愈发向谈判聚焦，向和平靠拢。从亚洲、非洲到欧洲、美洲，从南方、北方到东方、西方，各国人民对和平的期盼越来越强烈，对和平的呼声越来越响亮。国际社会推动实现和平的条件正在逐步累积。今年9月联大一般性辩论期间，中国、巴西同阿尔及利亚等全球南方国家举行部长级会议，发起成立乌克兰危机和平之友小组，共同呼吁遵守战场不外溢、战事不升级、各方不拱火3原则，共同发出早日停火止战、支持政治解决的有力信号。历史反复证明，军事手段带不来持久和平，任何冲突的终点都将是谈判桌前。我们再次呼吁冲突当事方展现政治意愿，早日开启和谈，相向而行，停火止战。再次呼吁国际社会为此提供支持，创造条件，共同壮大促进和平的努力，形成劝和促谈的合力。主席，中方在乌克兰问题上的立场一以贯之，坚定明确。我们始终站在和平一边，站在对话一边。自危机爆发以来，中方始终主张各国主权领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章的宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。我们坚持对话谈判是解决乌克兰危机的唯一出路，同俄罗斯、乌克兰等有关各方均保持接触交流，积极开展穿梭外交，坚持不懈劝和促谈，推动政治解决。当前形势下，中方愿同有关各方进一步加强沟通，为推动和平曙光早日到来，乌克兰危机早日政治解决，继续做出不懈努力，发挥建设性作用。主席，刚才美国代表在发言中再次对中方污蔑抹黑，向中方甩锅推责，我们对此坚决反对。在此前的会议上，我已经就此多次做出回应，今天我就不重复。这里我只想简要地指出，乌克兰危机的爆发与持续至今与美国有很大关系。未来能否早日停火止战，实现政治解决，在相当程度上也取决于美方的态度和表现。我们希望美方的所作所为能经得起后人的评说和历史的检验。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we wish to express our gratitude to Under-Secretary General Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for having delivered a very important statement by the Secretary General on the Ukraine issue. As the conflict rages on, calls for dialogue and diplomacy continue to be overshadowed by the relentless drums of war. This conflict, pitting two sister and neighboring nations, one against the other, has pushed the very fabric of our international architecture for peace and security to its limits. Now, in a phase of a protracted attrition and exhaustion, the conflict has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the people of Ukraine, deepening global divisions and shaken the very foundations on which the United Nations has been built. Moreover, the conflict has widened rifts between nations, eroded trust in international cooperation, and introduced grave risks to an already fragile global order, including the looming specter of nuclear threat. The humanitarian toll has reached catastrophic proportions in Ukraine, compounded by the disregard for international law and international humanitarian law. In addition to this devastating human toll, this war has served as severely disrupted global food and energy supplies, destabilized economies, and exposed critical vulnerabilities of an already unfair and unequal international governance system. Mr. President, the Ukraine-Russia crisis represents possibly the sternest test to international peace and security in the 21st century, in an interconnected world where no nation is immune to the suffering of others. In its aftermath, the landscape of global diplomacy has been profoundly tested. The resurgence of Cold War era mindset and dynamics, the erosion of trust among major powers, and the growing dependence on military alliances underscore the severity of our shared predicament. We regret to note that this is totally in contrast with the spirit and understandings that led to the end of Cold War that we witnessed in the 90s, about 30 years ago. More leadership and vision based on peace, more commitment to our shared concept of collective security, more dialogue, more respect for the sanctity of treaties, and less reliance on modern military doctrines could possibly have brought us to a different outcome, to a more peaceful and less dangerous world. It would have saved us from what an American scholar termed as the rise and fall of peace on earth. Mr. President, at the heart of Mozambique's position on this conflict lies our unwavering commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and to our own Constitution that holds as paramount the primacy of peace and the settlement of disputes by peaceful means. We advocate diplomacy and negotiations in conflict resolution conducted in good faith. They should not be construed as a sign of weakness, but rather as the foundational pillars of peace. Our humble experience as a nation that was built on the stone of a liberation struggle has taught us that it takes courage to wage war, but it takes even greater courage to make peace. Mr. President, it is deeply regrettable that despite numerous scheduled and unscheduled sessions, debates and briefings, the Council has remained paralyzed, unable to overcome divisions and act decisively in the interests of peace and security in Ukraine and in the world. Mozambique urges Security Council members and all parties involved to prioritize unity and collective action in search for peace, security, and stability. We join the wider international community in calling for an immediate end to this conflict on the basis of the principles and ideals that led to the founding of the United Nations and that bring us together in this chamber. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the UK for convening this important meeting. I also extend my gratitude to USGT Carlo for her comprehensive briefing. I also welcome Ukraine Foreign Minister to this meeting. As we are nearing 1,000 days since the war on Ukraine started, it is simply deplorable that we continue to witness the loss of human lives, mass displacement, and destruction of critical infrastructure. The war is also shaking the international order. Indeed, the aggression of a permanent member of the Security Council against a neighboring sovereign state tramples the fundamental principles of the UN Charter: sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and refrain from the use of force. In addition, we see the global non-proliferation regime underpinned by the NPT precariously eroding. Since the war broke out, Russia, which led global efforts to establish the current non-proliferation regime, has heightened its nuclear rhetoric, suspended the New START Treaty, and de-ratified the CTBT. The ongoing war also represents a blatant violation of the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine agreed to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state in exchange for security assurances that have now been disregarded by a signatory state. The safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is also under threat. Furthermore, this unjustifiable war has been conducted in a cruel manner, involving wanton attacks on residential areas, schools, and hospitals, according to the recent UN reports. Mr. President, as the war continues on, its international repercussions have expanded both in magnitude and scope. Millions of refugees fled Ukraine into Europe. Global food, fuel, and fertilizer prices soared, particularly affecting the global south. Russia is even bringing in other countries to sustain its war machine. Among the various outside help for Russia, the most egregious form of abetting Russia's aggression on Ukraine has come from North Korea. The DPRK is estimated to have shipped about 20,000 containers to Russia since August of last year. This amount of giant shipping containers could carry as many as 9.4 million artillery shells. Yet no one knows how many more munitions will be on the way from the DPRK. Among the some 200 munitions factories in North Korea, those factories producing weapons shipped to Russia are now running at full capacity. Mr. President, now we clearly see yet another level of escalation. My government confirmed last Wednesday that North Korean troops dispatched to Russia have completed their deployment to the battlefield near the Kursk Oblast of Russia and are already engaged in combat operations. This is the first time since the Korean War North Korea is engaged in actual combat with massive troops, about 11,000 soldiers. Russia and the DPRK signed a new treaty, the so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, last June during President Putin's visit to Pyongyang. This follows a 29-year-long hiatus since Russia renounced its 1961 Mutual Military Assistance Treaty with North Korea. We see a possible nexus between the ratification of this treaty and the North Korean soldiers' engagement in combat operations today. Contrary to Russia's claim that their military cooperation should not worry anyone, as it is not directed against third countries, it does concern everybody, as it clearly infringes upon the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a state, and it directly affects many other countries in both Europe and Northeast Asia. This demonstrates how the security of Europe is linked to that of East Asia. Dear colleagues, what is even more troubling is that this movement may only be the beginning. You may be surprised to learn that the DPRK has a larger amount of military troops, well over 1 million, than Russia. North Korea is a militarized garrison state. Men are required to serve in the military for 10 years, and women for 7 years. Their mandatory military service is more like enslavement, as the OHCHR's recent thematic report on DPRK's forced labor pointed out. Pyongyang has not disclosed the dispatch of its troops to Russia, to its own people. The DPRK even relocated family members of dispatched soldiers to special sites to isolate and prevent them from spreading rumors. And these soldiers are even being issued fake IDs to disguise themselves as Russians. This is more akin to mercenaries than regular state-level military intervention. Mr. President, we don't know exactly what kind of payoff the DPRK is actually receiving from Russia yet, but we are sure that Kim Jong-un will exploit Moscow's desperate position and obtain whatever Russia is willing to offer: fuel and energy, or high-end military technology for its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Against all these possibilities, the Republic of Korea will respond to this unlawful military cooperation, which threatens our national security, and will take corresponding measures commensurate to ensuing developments alongside our partners. Mr. President, as this war has dragged on for 1,000 days now, I would like to offer some points of reflection. As Korea has also experienced a long, brutal war. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 saw even larger number of casualties during the armistice negotiations than during the preceding period war, as both sides fiercely fought to grab every inch of land before the armistice was signed. One of the major differences is that the battlefront of the Korean War during the armistice negotiations was more or less similar to the border of status quo antebellum. In contrast, in Ukraine, starting armistice negotiations now would mean dealing with a completely different battlefront from what it was at the outset of the war. In retrospect, with the crucial help of the free nations committed to UN Charter, the Republic of Korea was able to survive from the Korean War and now thrives with freedom and prosperity. This is why the Republic of Korea is helping Ukraine to survive from the invasion and then to revitalize, rebuild, and flourish. The Republic of Korea will continue to support all international efforts toward this goal and will continue its principled backing for Ukraine through its bilateral Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I begin by thanking you for convening this high-level briefing. I also thank USG Carlo for her insightful and sobering remarks. I welcome the participation of the Ukrainian Foreign Minister to our meeting today. In 2 days, we will mark the 1000th day anniversary since the Russian Federation decided to start a war of aggression against its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, in violation of the UN Charter. As we approach this grim milestone, Malta remains firm in its belief that this Council must ensure that international law is upheld at all times. Regrettably, Russia's actions on the ground and in this Council constitute a direct affront to the principles and values that unite us. The unrelenting attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, in particular on energy infrastructure, which has direct impact on Ukraine's social and economic development and on preparations for the upcoming winter months, have to stop. This Council must reiterate in no uncertain terms its call on all parties to uphold IHL and the principles of distinction and proportionality. Malta also continues to call for full, safe and unfettered access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground in Ukraine. Just last Saturday, the Russian Federation launched a massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine, targeting multiple targets with a focus on energy infrastructure. People were killed and injured, and the country suffered significant damage to its energy plants, which led to blackouts and country-wide restrictions. This was one of the largest attacks on Ukraine in recent months, with a clear intention to deplete Ukraine's energy production capacity ahead of the winter months. This news is coupled with the increased intensity of missile and drone attacks, which have picked up during recent months. Ukrainian civilians continue to suffer the brunt of this unjustified and unprovoked war. President, we again express our deep concern with regards to the transfer of weapons and ammunition from DPRK and Iran to the Russian Federation. These transfers prolong Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine and continue to deteriorate the humanitarian situation in the country. Some of these transfers violate UN Security Council resolutions. In addition, the deployment of troops from the DPRK on the front lines in Ukraine represents a dangerous escalation. The presence of foreign troops on the front lines broadens this war. It also directly endangers European as well as global peace and security. We call on all states to stop supporting and enabling this illegal war of aggression. President, we stress the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine, and reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Register of Damage. We also further reiterate our support for the establishment of a special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. This Council cannot lose sight of this war and the importance of striving towards setting the conditions for negotiations to secure peace. We need to focus on achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter. We will support all efforts aimed at achieving such goals, providing that Ukraine is included at all steps during this process. We can never accept a world in which might is right, and therefore once again call upon the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw all its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. Until that day comes, Ukraine has a right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Carlo for the update and welcome the participation of His Excellency Andrii Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, in today's meeting. Mr. President, we meet today for yet another important meeting on the conflict in Ukraine. This time, on the eve of the 1000th day since the war began. Guyana is deeply concerned that for every additional day of this war, innocent lives continue to be lost.
We are alarmed by the recent escalations and reiterate our call for a peaceful end to this war. We also demand that the parties uphold their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects from harm. The war has taken a heavy toll on the civilian population, especially in Ukraine. Millions have been displaced and forced to live as refugees in foreign lands. Those unable to flee live in constant fear of losing their lives, loved ones, and livelihoods. It is time to put an end to the suffering, to the death and destruction being inflicted upon innocent civilians for over 3 years. Mr. President, in its latest situation report, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documented at least 183 civilian deaths and 903 injured in Ukraine in October. OHCHR has also consistently documented cases of arbitrary detention, torture, summary executions, sexual violence, transfers and deportations of children, and forced conscription of protected persons. This Council has a duty and a responsibility to respond to what is taking place. We must continue to demand that the parties comply with their legal obligations and find a peaceful end to this war. We have the entire UN mechanism at our disposal. With eminently qualified and skilled experts in all fields, we must put the system to work for peace. While we work to find a way to end the conflict, civilian lives must be protected. We must do more to agree on practical measures to minimize civilian harm. We appreciate the important contribution that UN agencies, international NGOs, and local NGOs have made in responding to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We hope these positive efforts will continue and call for independent monitors, including OHCHR, to have regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detained persons. We further call for continued international support for the victims of this war, inclusive of medical, psychological, and legal support, with particular attention to children and survivors of sexual violence. Guyana is encouraged by the momentum building in various capitals to advance peace initiatives and to ensure that children and prisoners of war are safely returned home. We remain hopeful that these initiatives will yield concrete results. Mr. President, it is without any doubt that the prolongation of this war poses increasingly grave risks and consequences for all concerned and for international peace and security. It has brought nothing but suffering and trauma for generations of Ukrainian and Russian citizens, not to mention its regional and international ramifications. Guyana reiterates its call for an immediate end to the hostilities. We also join the international community in reaffirming the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine. Finally, we urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and the continued engagement of the United Nations, led by the Secretary General. We will continue to support all peace efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Di Carlo pour son exposé. Demain, cela fera 1000 jours que la Russie a déclenché contre l'Ukraine une guerre illégale, injustifiable et brutale. 1000 jours que la Russie a choisi d'agresser un État souverain qui ne la menaçait pas pour en annexer des territoires au mépris de la Charte des Nations Unies et de ses principes. Depuis 1000 jours, la Russie mène cette guerre en accumulant les violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Elle conduit des frappes délibérées contre les populations et les biens civils de l'Ukraine, avec un bilan humain catastrophique qui ne cesse de s'alourdir. Elle continue à cibler les infrastructures énergétiques du pays, forçant le peuple ukrainien à affronter dans le froid un troisième hiver de guerre. Elle met en péril la sécurité alimentaire mondiale en frappant les infrastructures portuaires et céréalières, malgré les efforts de la France et de ses partenaires pour permettre l'envoi de céréales aux populations civiles, par exemple à Gaza. La Russie utilise les violences sexuelles comme arme de guerre et ne recule pas devant les transferts forcés et les déportations d'enfants ukrainiens. Les responsables de ces crimes devront rendre des comptes. Depuis 1000 jours, la Russie s'obstine à poursuivre son agression malgré le coût croissant de son effort de guerre. Pour cela, elle est prête à saper les fondements de l'architecture mondiale de non-prolifération en se fournissant en armes, munitions et missiles balistiques auprès de l'Iran et de la Corée du Nord, en violation des résolutions de ce Conseil. La présence sur le territoire russe de soldats nord-coréens et leur implication potentielle sur le front ukrainien représente une nouvelle violation flagrante du droit international et une grave escalade du conflit. Monsieur le Président, depuis 1000 jours, le peuple ukrainien se défend avec un courage admirable. Dès le premier jour de la guerre, la France a choisi de se tenir à ses côtés. Nous apportons à l'Ukraine le soutien militaire et humanitaire dont elle a besoin. Elle doit pouvoir lutter pour son indépendance, pour son intégrité territoriale. Elle doit être libre de choisir ses alliances et son destin. Le droit de l'Ukraine à la légitime défense inclut la possibilité de frapper toute cible militaire impliquée dans des opérations visant son territoire, conformément à l'article 51 de la Charte. L'Ukraine doit être mise en situation de se défendre et d'engager, lorsqu'elle le décidera, des négociations en vue d'atteindre une paix juste et durable. Il ne saurait y avoir de paix viable si nous laissons l'agresseur imposer sa volonté par la force. Le combat des Ukrainiens nous concerne tous. Cette guerre est une atteinte aux principes de la Charte des Nations Unies, dont la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale. Elle déstabilise les fondements de l'ordre international dont nous sommes les garants. Elle a fait l'objet d'une très large condamnation par l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies. Laisser cette guerre atteindre ses objectifs, c'est prendre le risque de voir prospérer partout la loi du plus fort, les politiques de révision agressive des frontières, la revendication de sphères d'influence au mépris de l'égalité souveraine des États. Nul n'a intérêt à laisser s'installer la loi de la jungle. Tel est le sens de notre engagement aux côtés de l'Ukraine. Nous continuerons de soutenir la formule de paix du président Zelensky, dans le cadre de laquelle la France a organisé une conférence sur la sûreté et la sécurité nucléaire à Paris le 17 octobre dernier. Nous continuerons d'agir pour une paix juste et durable, conforme aux résolutions que l'Assemblée générale a adoptées à une très large majorité. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, presidente. Agradezco a la secretaria general adjunta de Carlo por el informe que ha presentado a nombre del secretario general Guterres. Saludo la presencia de altas autoridades en esta Cámara. Millones de personas continúan siendo víctimas de este conflicto. No se detiene el abandono forzado de hogares por parte de miles de familias. Se multiplican cicatrices que tardarán generaciones en sanar. La degradación ambiental es todavía inconmensurable. No cesa la devastación de viviendas, de escuelas y centros de atención médica, así como de infraestructuras críticas, especialmente las del sector energético. La situación humanitaria pone en riesgo a millones de personas, lo que de cara al invierno produce desesperanza. Aumentan las ofensivas y las olas de ataques con drones y misiles bajo el riesgo de convertirse en endémicas. Se intensifican las divisiones geopolíticas, afectando la estabilidad global y desafiando los pilares que sostienen la paz y seguridad internacionales. Señor presidente, sobre estos enunciados podrían elaborarse sendos discursos que llevarían a una conclusión indisputable. la Carta de las Naciones Unidas del Derecho Internacional y el derecho internacional humanitario siguen erosionándose de manera alarmante con cada desarrollo de esta injustificable guerra. Como expresé en la sesión de esta mañana sobre la guerra en Medio Oriente, cada vida perdida es irreparable y especialmente chocante cuando se trata de niños. Ya es suficiente. La violencia debe cesar de inmediato. Señor presidente, colegas, las partes están obligadas a proteger a la población civil y respetar plenamente el derecho internacional humanitario. La ayuda humanitaria debe llegar sin obstáculos a quienes la necesitan, incluyendo los territorios ocupados. Los actores humanitarios deben poder operar con seguridad y sin restricciones. No podemos subestimar los riesgos que suponen una mayor escalada del conflicto y sus implicaciones para la seguridad internacional. Es crucial que las partes encuentren caminos hacia la desescalada y eviten cualquier acción que pueda agravar aún más la situación. El respeto a la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la independencia política de los estados no es negociable. No existe disposición alguna en la Carta que admita o legitime el uso o la amenaza del uso de la fuerza como medio para resolver las disputas entre las naciones. A 1000 días de iniciada la agresión contra Ucrania y alrededor de un centenar de reuniones formales sobre la guerra en Ucrania, se conocen de manera meridiana las posiciones planteadas. Lo que corresponde ahora al Consejo es debatir sobre pasos concretos, responsables y valientes que contribuyan a detener el conflicto, así como valorar toda iniciativa de buena fe que favorezca este propósito compartido de la comunidad internacional. Recordemos que a pesar de las divisiones existentes, este órgano ya se mostró unido en la declaración de la Presidencia de 6 de mayo de 2022 sobre Ucrania y reconoció que en virtud de la Carta todos los Estados miembros se han comprometido a resolver sus controversias internacionales por medios pacíficos. Señor presidente, en línea con su vocación de paz, el Ecuador promueve la solución pacífica de los conflictos a través del diálogo y la diplomacia, y por tanto, reafirmo su compromiso de seguir trabajando para avanzar hacia soluciones que permitan alcanzar la paz en estricto respeto a los principios establecidos en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, el derecho internacional y la soberanía, independencia e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, есть определенный символизм в том, что именно наши британские коллеги, председательствующие в Совете Безопасности, в текущем месяце продавили проведение сегодняшнего заседания, приурочив его к 1000 дням с момента перехода украинского кризиса в горячую фазу. Мы еще раз получили прекрасную возможность убедиться, что для вас и ваших коллег это не более чем броский медиаповод для шельмования России, навешивания на нее тех затасканных ярлыков, которым предсказуемо изобиловали выступления западных членов Совета. А в вашей стране, Великобритании, русофобия уже давно, задолго до февраля 2022 года была возведена в ранг государственной политики. Позвольте вам напомнить, что, готовясь к сегодняшнему заседанию, выпустили еще один медиаповод, который имеет гораздо более важное значение в контексте украинского кризиса, чем выбранная вами дата. В прошлую пятницу, 15 ноября, исполнилось ровно 950 дней с момента визита бывшего главы правительства Великобритании Бориса Джонсона в Киев. Когда он, как мы все сегодня уже достоверно знаем, отговорил главу киевского режима подписывать парафированное в Стамбуле мирное соглашение с Россией, которое остановило бы военные действия. Тогда мы были очень близки к этому. В качестве жеста доброй воли Россия даже вывела войска с севера Украины, в частности, и непосредственной близости к Киеву. Иными словами, спустя 50 дней после начала нашей специальной военной операции, когда потери в рядах вооруженных сил Украины были не такими существенными, военные действия имели все шансы прекратиться, если бы не вмешательство британского премьер-министра, убедившего Зеленского, что ему стоит продолжить воевать и что с помощью западного оружия и поддержки он вполне может нанести России стратегическое поражение, в котором британский премьер и его западные подельники как раз и были заинтересованы. А чтобы как-то объяснить подобный поворот украинской мировой общественности, при непосредственном вовлечении британских спецслужб и СМИ была состряпана абсолютно топорная провокация в Буче, когда уже после отхода российской армии были свезены и разложены на улице трупы людей, происхождение и подлинную причину смерти которых так никто и не потрудился объяснить, несмотря на наши неоднократные запросы. В общем, выходит так, что Великобритания подтолкнула киевский режим в сторону неминуемого разгрома, спровоцировав его выбор в пользу продолжения конфронтации с Россией. Я думаю, что на Украине долго не забудут того, что именно благодаря этим действиям вашей страны это государство сегодня находится в ужасающем экономическом состоянии, потеряло большую часть своей армии и военной техники, а также лишилось как минимум 4 регионов, помимо еще в 2014 году вышедшего из состава Украины Крыма. Украинцы давно уже не хотят воевать. О том, что такое добровольцы, в украинской армии уже года 2 как забыли. И киевский режим, закрыв мужчинам выезд из страны, сегодня отлавливает уклонистов на улицах, в том числе с применением огнестрельного оружия, и бросает их в бессмысленную мясорубку практически без всякой подготовки. Восточный фронт ВСУ в Донбассе рушится на глазах. Вы прекрасно осведомлены о темпах продвижения российской армии, а режим Зеленского, пытаясь сохранить поддержку Западу, предпринял абсолютно бессмысленную вылазку в Курскую область и попытался захватить и заминировать Курскую атомную электростанцию, что стоило ВСУ несколько десятков тысяч хорошо подготовленных солдат. Эта авантюра стала фатальной ошибкой и лишь ускорила неминуемое грядущее поражение Украины на поле боя, избежать которого ей не поможет никакое новое западное вооружение. Инициатором сегодняшнего заседания следовало бы в порядке транспарентности поделиться с нами тем, какую баснословную прибыль получила Великобритания за почти 3 года военной поддержки Украины. Как обогатились на крови и трагедии простых украинцев ваши оружейные компании. А ваше оборонное ведомство благополучно избавилось от старой военной техники, которую все равно необходимо было утилизировать. А еще неплохо было бы рассказать и о сопровождающей эти процессы коррупции, о масштабах которой можно только догадываться. Так, как пишут сами украинские СМИ, после победы на выборах в США Дональда Трампа среди украинской элиты началась паника даже не из-за того, что США могут пересмотреть помощь Украине, а из-за того, что новые власти могут захотеть разобраться со всеми теми деньгами, которые отправлялись на Украину, и провести полный аудит уже предоставленной помощи. Этот сценарий, как дружно подмечают украинские эксперты, для Зеленского гораздо более страшен, ведь значительная часть помощи попросту разворовывается и присваивается просроченным украинским президентом и его окружением. С учетом того, что объемы только военной помощи киевской хунте со стороны Великобритании с февраля 2022 года составили 9,7 миллиарда долларов США, свой вклад в рост коррупции на Украине, вне всякого сомнения, вносит и ваша страна. Правда, вряд ли мы дождемся каких-либо соответствующих расследований со стороны британских властей, ведь в подобных случаях следователям, как известно, важно не выйти на самих себя. Господин председатель, собственно говоря, для тех, кто знаком с историей Соединенного Королевства, страны, с историей Соединенного Королевства, ее многолетнее вмешательство на Украине, кульминацией которого стали упомянутые нами выше действия, не стало каким-то откровением. Ведь стравливанием соседей, внесением разлада между государствами и народами, а потом поддержкой одних из них против других, Великобритания с упоением и знанием дела занимается на протяжении столетий. Все ваши бывшие колонии могут рассказать об этом в красках. К слову сказать, из нынешних 193 членов ООН только 22 государства могут похвастаться тем, что на их территорию никогда не вторгались и с ними никогда не воевала Великобритания. Наша страна здесь не является исключением. Последним таким отражением стала британская интервенция после революционных событий 1917 года, когда Россию пытались растащить на куски различные хищники и стервятники. Но мы выстояли, прошли через это, окрепли, и теперь вынуждены бороться против новой, опосредованной интервенции членов, воюющих против России на Украину НАТО, включая Великобританию. Именно так можно воспринимать не только продолжающуюся накачку киевского режима оружием и его подпитку разведданными, но и присутствие британских инструкторов и наемников, сотни из которых уже ликвидированы, а также попытки локализации на Украине британскими специалистами производств беспилотников, ракет и безэкипажных катеров. Понимаем, что Великобритании и в 21 веке оставить Украину и Россию в покое сложно, ведь гены тех колонизаторов, которые веками бесчинствовали в Азии, Африке и Европе, сказываются. Все мы знаем, что Британская империя жестоко и цинично подавляла сопротивление своих колоний в течение 250 лет, прибегала к насильственной ассимиляции и расовой дискриминации, забывая о простых человеческих ценностях и правах народа, находящихся под ее контролем. Именно мирное население колонизированных стран расплачивалось своей жизнью и свободой за имперские амбиции метрополии. Достаточно вспомнить хотя бы этнические чистки в Ирландии, когда из более 1,5 миллиона человек населения после британского завоевания осталось лишь 850 тысяч. А во время Второй Бурской войны на рубеже 19-20 веков, именно англичане первыми изобрели концлагеря, изгоняли в них гражданское население, чтобы оно не помогало бурской армии. Сколько человек тогда погибло, неизвестно, ведь британцы не считали коренное население Африки за людей и, в принципе, не документировали потери среди африканцев. Хотя известно, что в Кении после восстания Мао-Мао британцы устроили массовые репрессии, убив порядка 300 тысяч представителей этой народности, и еще 1,5 миллиона человек загнали в лагеря и превратили в рабов. А в Индии, который за период британского владычества был нанесен огромный ущерб, только жертвами спровоцированного в Великобритании голода стали от 15 до 29 миллионов человек. Последствия действий бывших колонизаторов ощущаются в современном мире до сих пор. И хотя колониальные империи формально ушли в прошлое, старые методы давления, манипуляции, вмешательства в суверенные дела продолжают использоваться в новых формах. Британия здесь не только не исключение, а скорее законодатель мод, и до сих пор, испытывая фантомные боли по империи, над которой никогда не заходило солнце, ностальгируя по утерянному мировому господству, применяет вместе с франко-саксонскими единомышленниками шантаж и санкции, занимается свержением неугодных правительств путем цветных революций, одной из жертв которых в 2014 году и стала Украина. Мы все это говорим к тому, что никакого морального права обвинять и упрекать в чем-либо нашу страну, поставившую перед собой задачу избавиться от взросшенного Западом националистического и неонацистского осиного гнезда на наших границах, нет и быть не может. До тех пор, пока угрозы от него, включая поглощение Украины НАТО, не будут устранены, до тех пор, пока не прекратится дискриминация русскоязычного населения по языку, вере, истории, до тех пор, пока на Украине не прекратят обелять и возвеличивать пособников Гитлера, будет продолжаться наша спецоперация. Ее цели будут реализованы в любом случае дипломатическим или военным путем, вне зависимости от каких-либо мирных планов и схем, разрабатываемых на Западе в интересах спасения актера развлекательного жанра Зеленского и его клики. И вне зависимости от милитаристского угара демократической администрации, которая, с треском проиграв президентские выборы и утратив доверие большей части собственного населения, раздает, по сообщениям СМИ, самоубийственное разрешение режиму Зеленского использовать дальнобойное вооружение для ударов вглубь территории России. Возможно, самому Джо Байдену в силу многих причин уже нечего терять. Но поражает близорукость руководства Великобритании и Франции, которые спешат подыграть уходящей администрации и втягивают не только свои страны, но и всю Европу в полномасштабную эскалацию с крайне серьезными последствиями. Именно об этом нашим бывшим западным партнерам стоило бы как следует подумать, пока не поздно. Об этом должны помнить и те, кто в последнее время заговорил о некой заморозке фронта и различных схемах, подобных отвергнутым в свое время Украиной и ее западными кураторами Минским соглашением. Не теряйте времени. Доверия этим обманным схемам у нас больше нет, и нас устроит только такое решение, которое устранит коренные причины украинского кризиса и не позволит ничему подобному повториться. А о попытках победить Россию на поле боя мы вам советуем забыть. Европа уже не раз это пыталась сделать, и чем это для нее каждый раз заканчивалось, хорошо известно. Благодарю вас.
I note the statement from the representative of the Russian Federation. In my national capacity, I don't propose to dignify that statement with any kind of response, other than to note that it was a series of lies, misinformation, and deflection. I will allow Ukraine to speak for itself in terms of its own actions in this conflict. I now resume my function as President, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States who's asked for the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for taking the floor, but I just need to respond very briefly to some comments that were made by the representative of the People's Republic of China. Let me just say very briefly that the U.S. will not ignore the support being given by China to Russia's military-industrial base. And we will continue, as I've said many times, to call out and condemn this support by China and others abetting Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, which, as we all know and shouldn't need to be reminded, is in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Countries cannot claim to support peace and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity while taking actions that undercut both. And my last point, just to respond to my Chinese colleagues' comments that the U.S. will be judged badly by history for in some way instigating this war against Ukraine. On the contrary, it will be China through its no limits partnership with Russia as it carries out an illegal war of aggression against the Ukrainian people that will be judged by history and undoubtedly very badly. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
谢谢主席。我希望我的美国同事在发言前，最好先了解一下当前的形势。当前的形势是什么？就是要求和平的呼声高过叫嚣战争的鼓噪，推动团结合作的努力高过挑动对立对抗的图谋。希望我的美国同事能够明白，刻意的去扩大危机、延长战争，借机打压其他国家，推进自身的地缘战略，这种图谋不会得逞。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Andrii Sybiha, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, Mr. President, as well as my British colleague. I will not dignify the lie of Russian envoy, total lie. So, Mr. President, I would like to thank the UK presidency for convening this meeting and for its strong leadership. We do really appreciate. As we mark 1,000 days of Russia's full-scale invasion, let's not forget that Russian aggression against Ukraine has already lasted over 10 years. I departed for this meeting during one of the largest air attacks in months. Russia launched over 200 drones and missiles at peaceful Ukrainian cities. I spent a sleepless night with my family, with my kids, just like thousands of Ukrainian families. Russia struck critical civilian infrastructure once again, ordinary residential buildings, energy system, transmission substations of our nuclear power plants. This is a direct threat to nuclear safety and security. In some cities like Odessa and Sumy, many people are without power and heating. 10 people were killed in Odessa and 12 people, including 2 children in Sumy. Many more were injured. These strikes are Russia's response to everyone who recently called and visited Putin, asking him for peace. Putin wants war, not peace, and we must increase the price of the war for him. 1,000 days is a very big number. On one hand, it proves Ukrainian bravery in the face of brutal Russian aggression, as well as the support of our partners, for which we are grateful. On the other hand, this number proves the failure of the international community, including this esteemed Council, to stop wars of aggression and atrocities. We must be honest, international mechanisms have failed. They are not working. We need to create new tools. We need to be principled and united to restore respect for the UN Charter. Mr. President, 1,000 days of resistance to a total war is an enormous price to pay for a nation that simply wants to be free and live a normal life. Today I will speak about the price of the war. The price we Ukrainians are paying, the price people around the world are paying, and the price the aggressor must pay. But most importantly, I will speak about the price of appeasement. In other words, what the world will have to pay if it chooses appeasement instead of just peace. The price the world will have to pay if world leaders choose weakness instead of strength. The goal of achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is urgent. Whatever the price of achieving is now, the price of further failures will be much, much higher. By launching its invasion, Russia harmed many more countries and people than only Ukraine. This invasion has worsened many global crises. Russia weaponizes food, energy, and other resources, affecting millions of people. Russia's naval blockade of Ukrainian ports led to food shortages and record high food prices. About 400 million people around the world rely on Ukrainian grain. Many of them were put at the risk of hunger. Russia is also weaponizing energy and endangers people not only in Ukraine but also in other countries. This war was one of the primary factors that slowed global economic growth and increased inflation. Furthermore, such a blatant violation of international law caused a global security crisis. If Russian aggression succeeds, other aggressors will be tempted to attack their neighbors and commit atrocities. Since the beginning of its aggression in 2014, Russia has violated about 400 international treaties. That's the reality. Defense spending around the world is rising and taking resources away from education, healthcare, tackling climate change, and other important global issues. Mr. President, no one in the world pays a higher price for Russian aggression than the people of Ukraine. This is why they, and only they, must be the ones to define the terms of peace. Imagine what it's like to lose in 1 second your beautiful young wife and 3 children, aged 10 and 2 years, and just 2 months, because your home was struck by a Russian drone. This is what happened a few days ago to 34-year-old Maxim Kulik from Kryvyi Rih. This is the price of the war. This year, Russia intensified executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. We are currently investigating 49 criminal cases involving the killing of 124 of them. According to UN, 95% of our prisoners of war faced torture in Russian captivity, brutal tortures. Some of the most horrible crimes of this war are crimes against Ukrainian children. Russia stole every Ukrainian child's normal childhood. At least 659 children were killed by Russia since 2022, numbers that continue to rise. This is the price of the war. And let me be clear, for us in Ukraine, there is no difference where a child suffers. In Ukraine, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, or other regions, no child in the world deserves to suffer from the war. Widespread crimes and human rights violations are being committed right now against millions of Ukrainians who remain in the occupied territories. The forcible deportation of at least 20,000 Ukrainian children might be the largest state-run children kidnapping operation in history. Thousands of them remain in Russia. They are subjected to indoctrination, forced Russian citizenship, adoption of foster placement with Russian families, and even name changes. These actions by Russia violate the Genocide Convention, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Fourth Geneva Convention. In this regard, I refer to the Montreal Pledge made by participants in the recent Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of the Peace Formula. They pledged assistance for the return of children, and I urge everyone to join these noble efforts. Thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages are still held in Russian captivity without proper access of international monitors and medics. We remember all of our people, and we will not rest until we free all of them and return them home. The list of Russian atrocities committed in Ukraine proves that the current international tools are not working. We need new mechanisms to ensure accountability for the crime of aggression and all subsequent crimes. If this requires setting a precedent, let's set a precedent. If this requires amending the Rome Statute, let's amend it. We must act to restore international peace and security. Colleagues, the price of inaction or appeasement far exceeds the price of strong steps. If we allow Russia to continue aggression and go unpunished, this will create unacceptable risk for global security, nuclear safety, environment, migration, and other areas. Russia is now aligning itself with such rogue states as Iran and DPRK. This emerging axis is in an active phase and of undermining the global order. The involvement of regular Northern Korean troops marks a new level of escalation and global proliferation of war. This is a real part of a North Korean ballistic missile KN-23 that struck Ukraine. Such deadly missiles fall on our people constantly. They can carry around 500 kilograms of explosives. The most recent hit was Brovary near Kyiv on November 13th. We know precisely what North Korea wants to get from Russia in response: technology for missile, nuclear, and other military programs. This will have an impact far beyond the borders of two states, including in the Indo-Pacific. The same applies to the deepening of Russia's defense cooperation with Iran. By the way, we have proof that Russia started using thermobaric warheads on Iranian Shahed drones to cause maximum destruction. And the question is, what does Tehran want from Moscow in return? Again, very specific things that can further worsen the security situation in the Middle East. This war is much larger than Ukraine, and its price for the world can get much higher if we don't stop Russia now. In total, between February 2023 and October 2024, the Ukrainian Defense Forces recorded more than 4,600 cases of use by Russia of ammunition containing hazardous chemicals. Today's report of OPCW is a timely reminder of all the red lines crossed by Moscow. It confirms the evidence provided by Ukraine, in particular a grenade marked RGVO and the corresponding soil samples. We have proven that Russia uses prohibited chemical substances on the battlefield. For Russia, this is also a war for natural resources, a very colonial approach. They try to capture Ukraine's rich deposits of manganese, uranium, titanium, and other resources. And we must stop the aggressor from proceeding further if we want to avoid these critical resources falling into the hands of Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Russia currently loses around 1,500 soldiers killed and wounded in action per day. Russia loses in 10 days in Ukraine a comparable amount of soldiers to the Soviet losses in Afghanistan in 10 years of war. These are the bloodiest occupied square meters ever. This also shows how low is the price of human life in Russia. Mr. President, the world cannot afford peace in any cost in Ukraine, because in the end the price will be too high. It might lead to an even larger possible global war. We witnessed this in 2014. Then the prevailing argument among appeasers was, Russia only wants Crimea, it will not go further. But it did, and the weak response did not deter Russia, it encouraged further violations. Russia started the war in Donbass. Ukraine signed the Minsk agreement and held almost 200 rounds of negotiations with Russia. There were 20 ceasefire agreements. 8 years of peace process ended when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. By the way, next month will mark the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum. Today, this document stands as a reminder to the whole world, never trust Russia. Their word has no value. So why should anyone believe that Putin will act differently now or on a new argument? Not before we raise the price for his aggression. As a core principle of our approach, we must recognize that there can be no compromises on territorial integrity and sovereignty, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else. The fastest way to end this war is to increase the support of Ukraine. It needs to defend itself and to compel Russia's withdrawal. Equipping Ukraine with the necessary means and removing artificial limitations on weapon use will speed up just and lasting peace. Tightening sanctions will deprive Russia of funds for the war. Next year, Moscow plans to feed $146 billion into its war machine. At the same time, Russia's shadow fleet can bring at least $120 billion in oil revenues. We must cut these bloody revenues. Supporting Ukraine, President Zelensky's victory plan and the peace formula is the only realistic path to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine and the world. And one more important point. There is no justification for putting Ukraine and Russia on the same footing as two sides of the war. This is not a conflict between two parties. This is a war of aggression. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine defends itself. False moral equivalence must stop. Mr. President, let's realize the price we have already paid for this war, a war that no one wanted except Russia. Let's realize the price we will have to pay for appeasement. Let's take real action for real peace, peace through strength. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sybiha for his statements. Colleagues, I wish to remind speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing light on the collar of the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. And I give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her valuable briefing. I also welcome participation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andrii, in this meeting. As the war is about to enter its 4th year, the highly attritional nature of the conflict remains unsustainable for all parties involved. The cost of the war is mounting, having already inflicted profound suffering on millions in Ukraine and beyond. In addition to the worsening humanitarian crisis, the current situation continues to threaten nuclear security. Since the beginning of the war, Turkey has maintained a principled policy on 3 main fronts. First, commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, supporting any initiative that aims at achieving peace. And third, mitigating the fallout of the war. The risk of an uncontrolled escalation, posing a threat not only to Europe, but to global stability, is still a possibility. This escalatory trend might reach to an unmanageable level with severe regional and global repercussions. Despite the risks involved, there is still no strategic vision on how to end this war. Both sides are still investing in a military victory. However, the world cannot afford a prolonged war in Ukraine. That's why we need to focus our efforts on finding a workable, pragmatic and realistic plan to achieve peace to avoid a global catastrophe. We remain convinced that this conflict can only end through negotiations. In line with the UN Charter, any peaceful resolution of conflicts must advocate for a just peace rooted in international law. We must jointly continue our calls for restraint on use of force and leave room for diplomacy. Ultimately, a just peace can only be achieved through direct dialogue and mutual understanding. A result-oriented approach should be developed jointly before it's too late. Negotiations on various tangible topics, such as food and energy security, maritime safety in the Black Sea, and exchanging of prisoners of war, could be the basis for peace talks. The time has come to identify common ground to discuss how to reach a just and lasting negotiated settlement between the sides. To establish the much-needed peace in Ukraine, Turkey is prepared to play a facilitating role again when the sides are ready. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tomorrow, we will mark a solemn milestone, 1,000 days since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, it bears remembering that Russia's war of aggression actually commenced in February 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea. For more than a decade, a permanent member of this very council has perpetrated atrocities, bombarded civilians, and committed egregious human rights abuses in blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. Let me state it loud and clear. Russia continues to violate the basic principles of the UN Charter system, such as territorial integrity and national sovereignty, through its naked attempt at a land grab. Mr. President, Czechia is gravely alarmed by the recent escalation of the DPRK's direct involvement in this war of aggression. Not only is Pyongyang supplying ammunition and ballistic missiles to Russia, but it is now also deploying its troops in Russia to be used against Ukraine. Russia is brazenly violating the very Security Council resolutions for which it voted, undermining both the global non-proliferation regime and the authority of the UN Security Council. Moreover, the DPRK's direct involvement in Russia's war of aggression poses a dire threat to the Indo-Pacific security. We have repeatedly urged fellow UN member states, including China, to cease enabling Russia's aggression against Ukraine by providing Russia with political and military support. We are deeply concerned by credible reports that Chinese companies have been supplying goods with clear military applications, including one-way attack drones and engines for military UAVs. China's ongoing delivery of tools that Russia needs to continue its aggression against Ukraine and its people represents an intolerable perpetuation of this conflict. This in turn directly threatens European as well as international peace and security. Mr. President, as we mark 1,000 days of Ukraine's unwavering resistance against Russia's full-scale invasion, Czechia reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the Russian war of aggression. We remain fully committed to providing political, financial, humanitarian, and military support to Ukraine and its people as they exercise their legitimate right to defend their homeland. To conclude, I remain convinced that our common goal now must be to intensify efforts to ensure that Ukraine emerges victorious from this horrific war and secures a just and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening today's Security Council briefing. I also thank USG De Carlo for her valuable insights. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Today, we must recall the horror of peaceful towns and villages of Ukraine that 1,000 days ago, overnight, were turned into rubble, and their residents became victims of Russia's war crimes. Only in the town of Bucha, which was under Russia's troops' control in March 2022, suffered over 100 targeted killings. This weekend alone, Russia launched more than 120 missiles and 90 drones targeting Ukraine civilian infrastructure. In Odessa, 10 people were killed, over 40 injured. Russia continues to violate the UN Charter, disregarding multiple GA resolutions, including on principles of the UN Charter underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine that was adopted in February 2023 with a majority of 141 votes. Russia ignores the order of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend all military operations in Ukraine. Also on 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over allegations of involvement in the war crimes of child abduction during the invasion of Ukraine. Over 19,000 Ukrainian children have been taken from the Ukraine to Russia. Mr. President, Ukrainian people continue to fall victims of Russia's attacks. The latest OCHR report has documented that conflict-related violence since 2022 killed over 11,000 civilians and injured over 24,000, and the actual numbers are much higher. We are witnessing a disturbing surge in aerial attacks by Russia targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Over the past 2 months, the use of long-range drone attacks by Russia's forces has escalated dramatically. In this regard, I would like to express our appreciation for the work done by the UN in Ukraine, OCHA, UNHCR, and UNDP, and other humanitarian agencies working tirelessly and under threat to alleviate sufferings of the Ukrainian people facing Russia's war of aggression. In 2024, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania has been included in the Ukraine's regional refugee response plan coordinated by the UNHCR. It complements the government-led responses to provide protection and support for refugees from Ukraine. Over 170,000 refugees are being hosted in the Baltic states this year. Mr. President, Russia has stepped up its war of aggression by turning to alliance with the DPRK, which violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions, namely Resolution 1718, Resolution 1874, and Resolution 2270, all which Russia itself supported and committed to uphold. The DPRK's involvement by providing ballistic missiles and now troops and heavy weapons in Russia's war against Ukraine poses an increasing threat to regional stability in Europe and Asia with severe global repercussions. This escalation from Russia and the DPRK demands firm international response. We call on the Technical Secretariat of the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to monitor the situation in Ukraine closely, as Russia is reportedly using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Mr. President, we fully support Ukraine's victory plan. First and foremost, this includes Ukraine's joining NATO. Ukraine's membership in NATO is the key for long-term security and stability in Europe, and our own security is incomplete without it. We strongly reject attempts to pressure Ukraine to negotiate on unfavorable terms at the expense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity, as this approach has nothing to do with just and sustainable peace. Ukraine alone shall define the terms of peace in accordance with the principles of international law and Ukraine's peace formula, prioritizing its sovereignty and territorial integrity and holding Russia fully accountable. Only just peace can be truly sustainable. We demand Russia to unconditionally, completely, and immediately withdraw all its military forces and equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank USG Carlo for the briefing, and also to express my delegation's appreciation to the United Kingdom for allowing us to convey to the members of the Security Council our deepest and legitimate concerns as a neighboring country and the Russian aggression against Ukraine that is happening over 1,000 days tomorrow, already today in Europe. And I would say this is 1,000 days too many. This war of aggression unequivocally violates the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity and the UN Charter. It constitutes an intentional breach of international law and an attempt to change the peace and security architecture. Ukraine's response to this war of aggression is the legitimate mode of action of self-defense in line with the UN Charter, and Romania has been supporting Ukraine all throughout. It is our shared political and moral responsibility to support Ukraine in its fight for independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. We place our trust in international law and in the UN principles, and we believe each sovereign nation is free to decide its foreign and domestic policies. We condemn strongly deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian critical infrastructure, including recent attacks over the past few days. We heard today from USGD Carlo, as we heard in the past 1,000 days from other briefers, about the high price Ukrainian civilians are paying, and we just heard from Foreign Minister Sybiha on this exact high price the civilians in Ukraine are paying. And we are all too familiar with the severe impact of this war on food security, not only for Ukraine, but for many countries around the world. We are also confronted with a considerable high risk for maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, as USGD Carlo also mentioned, with Russian missiles endangering commercial ships. Mr. President, my last point today regards the future. The UN Charter needs to be at the core of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Accountability is at the forefront. No country should assist a war of aggression, irrespective of when or where it happens. The only option is an immediate and complete withdrawal of Russia's troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And this message has been valid on day one of the aggression, as it is now 1,000 days after. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honour of speaking on behalf of the European Union's member states, candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Georgia, and Liechtenstein, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino aligned themselves. I want to thank the UK for organising this meeting, and of course, USD Carlo for her very important briefing. Colleagues, tomorrow marks a somber milestone, 1,000 days since Russia has unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war of aggression that continues to shake the world. 1,000 days of senseless human suffering, 1,000 days of an unprecedented violation of the UN Charter, 1,000 days of inspiring courage and resilience by the Ukrainian people. In light of these grim circumstances, I would like to emphasize three key points. First, Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and its attempts to acquire territory by force concern every single EU member state. We must, all of us, condemn such actions today, because otherwise we will end up condoning similar blatant attacks on any and all of us tomorrow. Protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all UN member states, regardless of the size and power, is our collective duty. Second, Russia must abide by the will of the global community, as expressed in several resolutions of the UN General Assembly, and immediately and unconditionally cease its war of aggression, including its deliberate attack against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and energy sector. Attacks on civilian infrastructure have surged, leading to the highest civilian casualty rates since the start of the war. Yesterday morning, we witnessed yet another such massive Russian attack. Russia has a plan to weaponize energy and to pressure the Ukrainian people ahead of a freezing winter into submission, they hope. Shame on them. And Russia disregards the civilian lives in the territories it currently occupies. Extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, systematic use of torture, sexual violence, crimes against humanity. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable. And beyond Ukraine, Russia, of course, continues to weaponize food, has continued to intensify its efforts to disrupt the Black Sea corridor with attacks on civilian port infrastructure in and around Odessa. Here again, we have to condemn them, all of us. Third, we urgently need a comprehensive, just and lasting peace anchored in the UN Charter. To this end, Russia, the aggressor, must withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. No initiative about Ukraine can be taken without Ukraine. And any serious proposal for peace must be based on the UN Charter and international law. We urge third countries to cease all assistance to Russia's war of aggression, not just direct military support, but also provision of dual-use goods and other sensitive items. And we condemn the deepening military cooperation and arms transfers between the DPRK and Russia. They also flagrantly violate multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. Friends, participation of DPRK troops in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine would represent a unilateral hostile act by the DPRK at the reckless invitation of Russia, with grave consequences for European and global peace and security. And in closing, Mr. President, for the past 1,000 days, a brave Ukraine has been exercising its inherent right to self-defense in response to Russia's illegal, unprovoked, brutal aggression. We must continue to defend Ukraine's right to protect its territory and its people in line with the UN Charter. We must continue to protect the integrity of the UN Charter itself. And we must keep doing so for as long as it takes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. I extend my appreciation to Under-Secretary General Carlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. Let me also welcome the participation of Foreign Minister Andrii Sybiha of Ukraine in today's meeting. Today's Council agenda covers two extremely serious situations following this morning's briefing on the devastation in Gaza and Lebanon, particularly for civilians. We have now turned to the devastating consequences of Russia's war. This week marks a grim milestone, 1,000 days of Russia's harrowing war of aggression against Ukraine, 1,000 days of devastation and suffering for Ukraine's people, 1,000 days of Russia's massive attacks on civilian infrastructure in clear violation of UN's Charter. Russia bears sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis, depriving millions of civilians of access to housing, water, heating, and electricity. Russia's attacks have severely damaged or destroyed more than half of Ukraine's energy production capacity. Russia's full-scale war of aggression has had devastating consequences, not only in Ukraine, but across the globe. In recent weeks, Russia has intensified its attacks against civilians, critical infrastructure, grain storage facilities, ports, and civilian vessels in the Black Sea. These attacks have serious repercussions for the world's most vulnerable populations, those who rely on grain from Ukraine. We cannot stand idly by in the face of such actions. We will not accept a world where states can invade and subjugate their neighbors with impunity. Let us not forget that in the Ukrainian occupied territories, Russia is conducting a brutal campaign of cultural indoctrination and assimilation of Ukrainian children. The United Nations was created precisely to prevent such acts of aggression, to protect the principles of peace, sovereignty, and the right of all nations, large or small, to exist in security and dignity. Mr. President, while Russia continues its onslaught, others are working doggedly to find a way out of this nightmare. The Ukrainian 10-point peace formula, the joint communiqué on a peace framework, and the recent ministerial conference on the human dimension of the peace formula, hosted by Canada with Norway and Ukraine, make vital contributions to finding a way to peace. Any peace initiatives must be in line with the rules and principles of the UN Charter, including respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and internationally recognized borders. Any peace plan must also be crafted in collaboration with Ukraine. Russia continues to reject peace and presses forward with its brutal assault on Ukraine. Russia has engaged the largest ground forces to be seen in Europe since World War II. In addition to the massive Ukrainian civilian and military casualties, Russia's aggression over the last 1,000 days has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers killed or wounded, another testament to the depravity of this war. These massive losses, mainly of young men in their prime, have driven Russia to seek external support to sustain this illegal war. The DPRK and Russia have engaged in illegal weapons transfers, ammunition, artillery, and ballistic missiles, fueling and prolonging Russia's aggression and violating numerous Security Council resolutions. All states have an obligation not to aid or assist in an aggression. Russia's decision to train and deploy troops from the DPRK on the battlefield marks a dangerous escalation that further threatens regional and international security. This Council has a duty to condemn this escalation unequivocally. The Russian Federation is in continuous violation of international law, as well as undermining the status and authority of the Security Council itself. Russia's desperation will not deter our resolve. We will continue to stand up for the UN Charter and for Ukraine's right to defend its people and sovereignty in line with international law. Mr. President, we demand that Russia immediately withdraw its troops from Ukraine, reverse its illegal and dangerous course, and end this destructive war. Mr. President, while 1,000 days is a long time, there is one thing that has not changed. The Nordics will continue to stand with Ukraine, as we have done for 1,000 days, and we will remain by your side in your struggle. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iceland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, we are approaching the tragic milestone, 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Moscow not only continues to flout the most basic rules of international conduct, but is also seeking support from the third states and involving them in its aggression. Therefore, this war not only threatens regional stability and global security, but also exacerbates the world's most pressing political and economic problems, including the disruption of food supply chains. Russia's relentless onslaught against Ukraine escalated this weekend with one of the largest aerial attacks in the recent months. Targeting critical energy infrastructure across the country, Russia caused widespread power outages, significant property damage, and tragically the loss of innocent lives. Such attacks not only elicit immense physical and psychological harm, but also aim to undermine Ukraine's resilience and the harsh winter approaches. The looming energy crisis in Ukraine is further aggravated by the nuclear threat arising from the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Poland unequivocally condemns these heinous atrocities and demands an immediate end to Russia's brutal war. We also remind Russia that attacks directed against civilians, including stealing children and destroying civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks on densely populated areas, are clear violations of international humanitarian law and constitutes war crimes. Those responsible must be held accountable and justice must be served. Russian propaganda inverts reality, twisting also here in this chamber the definitions of the victim and aggressor. This blatant distortion directly contradicts UN General Assembly resolutions, which recognize this war as Russian aggression and condemned it. In this context, we reiterate that through its defensive operations to diminish Russia's capacity to wage its illegal war, Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to self-defense in full compliance with international law as enshrined in the Article 51 of this UN Charter. We will back the victim of this aggression for as long as it takes. Poland has earmarked almost 5% of its GDP for this assistance, with 1% of GDP allocated to support Ukraine and 4% of the GDP dedicated to the cost of assisting Ukrainian refugees. Mr. President, everyone yearns for a new chance at peace. However, any peace agreement must be forged through consent. No one should be compelled to accept a peace that does not align with the interests or aspirations of the victim. That being said, let me be very clear. There is no shortcut to peace. A just and lasting resolution must be agreed upon with Ukraine, with the participation of all affected countries and support of the international community. Any other path will only lead to a potential further suffering and instability. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. 1,000 days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a grim milestone in modern history. So many lives, too many lives, have been lost. Ukrainian children, civilians, and soldiers. Our thoughts are with all those who have suffered and lost their lives due to Russia's aggression, including those affected by this weekend's wave of massive airstrikes, which killed civilians and caused severe damage to Ukraine's power system. Targeting civilian infrastructure is unacceptable and constitutes a potential war crime. The Security Council must remain consistent and firm in condemning such actions, demanding that civilians be protected. Around the world, we hear resounding calls for an immediate end to this devastating war. And yet, in our pursuit of a sustainable peace in Ukraine, we must be clear. Russia's occupation and annexation of Ukrainian territories are unmistakable violations of international law and a blatant affront to the UN Charter, which cannot be justified through sham referenda or the like. We cannot condone Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty as a viable path to peace. Let us not forget the high cost of yielding to the illegal use of force by a state attacking its neighbor. Every member state of the United Nations must reject such a course. Russia must be held accountable. Germany remains steadfast in supporting Ukraine comprehensively, including its diplomatic efforts to end this conflict. Any peace must be based on the UN Charter and not imposed over the heads of the Ukrainian people who have borne the brunt of this aggression for 1,000 days now. We stand unwaveringly by Ukraine and call on Russia once again to end this war immediately and fully withdraw its troops. Only then we can build a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Italy fully aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and would like to add some considerations in its national capacity. I want to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this meeting at the grim milestone of 1,000 days since Russia's unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 1,000 days of war is a tragic reminder of the need to remain resolute in ensuring that international law prevails, not just in Ukraine, but wherever it is challenged. Italy remains committed to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, based on the principles of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We firmly believe that full implementation of these principles is a matter not in the exclusive interest of Ukraine and Europe, but of the entire UN membership, since they are the foundations that hold the international community together. These principles have been strongly evoked and reaffirmed by the G7 of Foreign Ministers meeting chaired by Italy in September on the side of the high-level week of the UN General Assembly. A clear message of support for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty has been reiterated by the G7 leaders' statement issued to mark the 1,000th day of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. In this regard, the G7 and partners foreign ministers expressed grave concern regarding the deployment of DPRK troops to Russia, as well as Russia's unlawful procurement of DPRK ballistic missiles in breach of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. We condemn Russia's increased attacks on civilian critical infrastructures and reaffirm our support for Ukraine's energy sector. Italy, in particular, is contributing to ensure Ukraine's resilience, providing, in addition to our bilateral aid, targeted financial support to EBRD projects for the country's hydroelectric output. In 2025, we will host the Ukraine Recovery Conference. Together, we will lay the foundations for a prosperous, independent Ukraine within our common European family. We must now call for an even greater involvement of all UN member states to contribute to the solution of this devastating, senseless war. We need diplomacy also to sustain the legitimate concerns and expectations of developing countries, which are impacted by the broader repercussion of this conflict in terms of disruptions to global supply chains and food security. We remain committed to collaborating with all partners ready to support peace efforts. Now it is time to intensify our collective efforts to achieve this goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Don't ask.